Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We're diving into a big one today, what some are calling the Mar-a-Lago Plan. This idea is floating around out there as a potential way to totally reshape the global economy. And with President Trump in his second term, trying to understand this strategy and what it could mean feels pretty important. So we're going to dig into the core ideas of this plan, see if things happening right now match up with it, even if no one's officially saying so. We'll compare it to a similar thing from the past, and then we'll think through what the future could hold and see how the rest of the world is reacting.
Yeah, I think to even begin unpacking this, it's important to grasp the central argument, as Stephen Miran has laid it out in his plan. And, his main contention is that the high value of the U.S. dollar, the strength of it, is actually the root cause of a lot of economic problems that we're facing here in the United States. And he specifically points to the struggles of American manufacturing and, the persistent trade deficits as a consequence of this strong dollar.
And why does he say the dollar's so strong? What's keeping it up there?
Well, Miran's argument is that the dollar's strength is mainly because of its status as the world's reserve currency. So because of that, there's this continuous global demand, for assets that are priced in dollars, especially U.S. Treasury bonds. So this demand, it kind of stays strong even if the dollar's value goes up and down a little bit.
So what you're saying is this strong dollar, it's like a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It makes things made here in America more expensive for people buying them in other countries. Our exports become less competitive. But then on the flip side, it makes those products coming into the U.S. from other countries cheaper for us here at home. So Miran's point is that the situation has really helped the financial sector in the U.S., but not so much for the manufacturing folks. It's led to job losses. So his main goal is to bring the dollar's value down a bit, to even out the playing field in an international trade and boost American industries.
Okay, so let's talk specifics. How does this plan, this Mar-a-Lago plan, propose to actually weaken the dollar and achieve all those other things? What are the main parts of this whole plan?
The plan has several key elements, all working together. So first, strategically weakening the dollar is at the center of it all. And Miran suggests, this can be done by things the U.S. does independently, but also through agreements with major trading partners. And he even proposes something called a Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is interesting because it makes you think of the Plaza Accord back in 1985. So in this scenario, imagine the U.S. sits down with its important trading partners and they coordinate what they're doing in currency markets to bring the dollar's value down a bit. And a key part of this is using tariffs, those taxes on imports, as a way to make sure those partners actually participate in this agreement.
So hold on, these tariffs, it's not just about protecting American businesses then, there's more to it.
Yeah, you got it. In the Mar-a-Lago Plan, tariffs aren't just about shielding American companies. They're also seen as tools, important tools for negotiation, maybe even to push people in a certain direction. Miran talks about imposing, some pretty big tariffs, like 60% on goods from China, at least 10% on things coming in from other countries. So these tariffs, they're supposed to make foreign goods more expensive, encourage people here to buy American-made stuff, and also bring in some cash for the government. And then the other thing is that the possibility of these tariffs, it's supposed to pressure other countries to do what the U.S. wants, especially when it comes to adjusting their currencies as part of this Mar-a-Lago Accord. And there's this idea of a currency offset that comes into play here. What it means is, if we slap a tariff on a product, that other country's currency might lose some value. And theoretically, that could help to prevent the prices from going way up for us, for consumers here, which, could help with inflation.
So there's this whole economic element. But it sounds like the Mar-a-Lago Plan isn't just about economics. It also includes this thing that's being called, coercive diplomacy.
Yeah, exactly. The plan is pretty clear that it wants to use America's economic and security power to kind of nudge other countries toward its goals. And, part of this is the threat of those increased tariffs, but it also includes potentially scaling back some of our security commitments, like in NATO, using that as leverage to get concessions from allies and trading partners. And there's even talk about, ranking countries based on how the U.S. sees their trade practices, currency policies, and how much they're on board with U.S. national security goals. And then this ranking could decide what level of tariffs they face.
And then on top of all of that, there's this kind of wild idea about dealing with the national debt.
Right. That's a really notable part of this whole plan, this radical concept of refinancing the U.S. debt. They're proposing that all those foreign governments holding on to U.S. Treasury bonds should be, well, encouraged, maybe even forced to trade them in for new 100-year bonds. These are often called century bonds. And these new bonds would have super low interest rates, maybe even zero interest. So basically, that would lock in a huge chunk of the debt at almost no cost for a really long time. And that would be a big relief for the U.S. government. The plan also talks about creating a U.S. sovereign wealth fund, potentially financed by, revaluing our gold reserves based on today's prices and maybe even using digital currencies. And this fund could then be another tool to manage debt and keep things financially stable in the long run.
It's wild, isn't it? Century bonds with zero interest, that's something else. But here's the thing. There's all this talk, detailed plans, and yet the Trump administration has downplayed it, even denied that there's a formal Mar-a-Lago plan.
Yeah, that's true. Miran's paper lays out this framework, but the administration hasn't really said, yeah, this is it, this is what we're doing. In fact, some statements even seem to contradict it. Like Miran himself, in an interview, said their main focus isn't some big global currency agreement, it's about fair tariffs. And Treasury Secretary Bessent has been pretty public about wanting a strong dollar, which seems to go against this whole weakening idea. Even President Trump downplays anything related to Mar-a-Lago when reporters ask him about it.
But even with all the denials, don't some of the things happening now, like the actual policies being put in place, seem to line up with these Mar-a-Lago ideas?
Yeah, you're right. There are things happening that fit with those key components, even if they're not saying, this is the Mar-a-Lago plan in action. Take tariffs, for instance. President Trump signed that order, adding another 10% tariff on stuff coming in from China right at the start of his second term. And those new 25% tariffs on cars made overseas, they're coming later in 2025, all about boosting American manufacturing, they say. And even with Canada and Mexico, our neighbors, those 25% tariffs on all their goods, it's a big deal. And Canada's already hitting back with tariffs of their own. So these tariffs, they're clearly a core part of the trade strategy, just like in Miran's plan.
And what about the U.S. commitment to NATO? All that back and forth, that uncertainty seems to fit in with this whole coercive diplomacy thing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. President Trump has never been shy about questioning NATO, whether it's fair, whether it's worth it for the U.S. And that's a big part of the coercive diplomacy idea in the Mar-a-Lago plan. He said out loud that maybe the U.S. wouldn't defend certain allies if they got attacked, and he's hinted that we might pull back if countries don't spend more on defense. He wants them to bump it up way past that 2% of GDP target. So it's making everyone nervous, wondering if the U.S. is really committed, and it could be a way to get those economic or strategic concessions they're looking for, just like in the plan.
It's fascinating and kind of scary, too, honestly. What about the bond markets? Anything happening there that seems connected to the debt stuff, the refinancing proposals?
Well, no one's out there swapping short-term treasuries for 100-year bonds just yet. But early 2025 has been interesting in the bond market. Those yields on the 10-year treasury, they've been going down. Now, that could be for a lot of reasons, but it's happening at the same time as all this other stuff, right? And there's talk about user fees on foreign holdings of treasuries, which could change things up even more. So we can't say for sure if these trends are because of the Mar-a-Lago plan, but it's all happening around the same time.
And then you've got the EU and China feeling the pressure from the U.S., which also seems to fit the pattern here.
Oh, definitely. The pressure's on. The Trump administration has been really clear about that, especially when it comes to trade imbalances and what they see as unfair practices from both the EU and China. It fits right in with the Mar-a-Lago approach. President Trump, he's warned about more tariffs on the EU and Canada if they do things that hurt the U.S. economy. And the EU is not backing down. They've already threatened to retaliate against those steel and aluminum tariffs. And then there's China. On top of the tariffs, there's talk of even stricter trade and technology restrictions, like limiting imports of semiconductors and access to advanced AI tech. It's all about using that economic pressure to get what they want in trade and tech. Classic Mar-a-Lago.
It's all connected, isn't it? Even the statements from key figures like President Trump himself and Miran and Bessent, they seem to support the idea that the Mar-a-Lago principles are, driving the bus, even if they're not explicitly saying so.
Yeah, you're picking up on that too. It's all there, just under the surface. President Trump, he keeps saying he wants to rewire the global trading system to benefit the U.S., bring back manufacturing jobs. He's all about allies paying their fair share for security. And Miran, well, he's been very clear in his writing that he wants a weaker dollar, policies that make importing less attractive, and more money from allies for defense. And then you have Bessent talking about a grand economic reordering, categorizing countries based on how much they line up with U.S. goals, which of course affects trade and security. So yeah, it might not be a straight up confession of, we're doing the Mar-a-Lago plan to the letter, but it's all pointing in that direction, isn't it?
Definitely. Now, a lot of people are comparing the Mar-a-Lago Plan to the Plaza Accord of 1985. Can you break that down for us, explain what that was and how this plan might be different?
Sure. So the Plaza Accord, that was back in 85, and it was an agreement between the U.S., Japan, West Germany, France, and the U.K., the big economies at the time. They all agreed to bring down the value of the U.S. dollar compared to the Japanese yen and the German Deutschmark. And the main reason was that trade was getting out of balance, especially between the U.S. and Japan, so they decided to step in and make changes to their currencies and economic policies to make those exchange rates shift. It did work to an extent. The dollar dropped in value and some of those U.S. trade deficits shrank. But with Japan, it wasn't as successful. There were deeper economic issues going on there. Now, the Mar-a-Lago Plan, it has that same idea of weakening the dollar to help U.S. exports compete better. But there are some really big differences. The Plaza Accord, it was all about working together, everyone agreeing to play their part. But the Mar-a-Lago Plan, it seems to be more about the U.S. going it alone, using its muscle to get things done. They're not afraid to use tariffs and even threaten to pull back on security guarantees to get other countries to do what they want, whether it's adjusting their currencies or restructuring debt. And on top of that, the world is a different place now than it was in 1985. China has emerged as a major economic power, which adds a whole new layer of complexity. So yeah, some people call the Mar-a-Lago Plan a Plaza Accord 2.0 because of that dollar devaluation goal, but the way they're going about it is way more aggressive, and that could make things a lot less stable.
So it's like the U.S. is saying, we're doing this our way, and you're either with us or against us, basically.
That's a pretty good summary, yeah. But what's the economic logic behind all of this, behind focusing on weakening the dollar?
Exactly. That's what I was going to ask. What's the thinking there?
The idea is if the dollar is weaker, American-made stuff becomes cheaper for buyers overseas, and that should mean more demand for our exports. At the same time, imports become more expensive for us here in the U.S., so maybe we buy less foreign stuff and more American-made goods. And the hope is that this will bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. because American production becomes more price competitive, and overall, it should shrink the trade deficit, that gap between what we import and what we export. But not everyone agrees with this. Some economists say, those manufacturing jobs aren't just going away because of the strong dollar. It's more about technology, automation taking over. And if the dollar gets weaker, yeah, our exports might do better, but everything we import gets more expensive, which could lead to inflation here at home. So it's a gamble, really.
It's like a delicate balancing act, isn't it? And all of this seems tied to a specific way of thinking about economics, what they call mercantilism. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to the Mar-a-Lago Plan?
Yeah, you're right on the money there. The Mar-a-Lago Plan, it definitely has that mercantilist vibe, which seems to be a big influence in the Trump administration. Mercantilism, it's this old school economic idea that says a country should export more than it imports. A trade surplus, that's a good thing, a sign of strength. A trade deficit, that's bad. And the Mar-a-Lago Plan, it's all about making more stuff here, relying less on imports, using those tariffs. It all fits right in with that mercantilist mindset. And there's this strong feeling, that being able to sell your stuff in the U.S. market, it's not a right, it's a privilege you got to earn. It's about doing things the way the U.S. wants, playing by their rules, being on their side. And that's how they justify those tariffs, those pressure tactics. It's all about getting what's best for the U.S., even if it means stepping on some toes.
It's a power play, isn't it? All right, so let's talk about the future. What are some of the ways this could all play out if the Mar-a-Lago Plan keeps rolling? Let's start with, the best case scenario, even if it's a long shot.
Okay, so in the most optimistic scenario, and this might be wishful thinking with the way things are globally right now, but let's say the U.S.'s key allies, those big trading partners, they all come to the table and agree to a coordinated, controlled weakening of the dollar. Everyone understands that keeping the global financial system stable is important, and they find ways to make it work. In this ideal world, U.S. exports would get a big boost because they're more competitive price-wise, and the trade deficit shrinks noticeably. And maybe, just maybe, foreign governments decide to swap out their short-term U.S. Treasury bonds for those century bonds, the ones with almost no interest. That would be a huge win for the U.S., easing the debt burden and making borrowing cheaper. And then, to top it off, NATO allies step up and boost their defense spending. Everyone's sharing the security burden more fairly. The alliance gets stronger. So in this best-case scenario, the U.S. gains a lot of clout on the world stage without causing a global financial meltdown or alienating all its allies.
It's a nice dream, but let's be real. What about a more likely scenario? Like if things go kind of okay, but not perfect.
Yeah, that's probably a more realistic view. So let's say those tariffs and that tough talk on trade, they do bring some companies back to the U.S., and the trade deficit gets a little smaller. But it comes at a price. Allies are feeling the squeeze, they don't like being pushed around, and relationships get strained. Global markets are a bit jittery, nobody knows what's going to happen next, things are unpredictable. And then you have the EU and China, they're not going to take those tariffs lying down. They're going to retaliate, and that'll offset some of those gains the U.S. was hoping for. And the debt restructuring, well, maybe not everyone's jumping on board with those century bonds, so the debt relief is only partial. It's a mixed bag, basically, with some wins, but also some losses and a lot of tension.
All right, now for the hard part. What's the worst case scenario? What if this all goes south?
The worst case scenario is pretty grim. Imagine a global recession, a big one, and the trigger. People lose faith in the U.S. economy, in the whole international financial system. They see those strong arm tactics, that risky dollar devaluation, and they get spooked. Investors, both here and around the world, they start dumping U.S. bonds because they don't think they're safe anymore. And when that happens, those yields on Treasury bonds, they shoot up, making it way more expensive for the government and businesses to borrow money. Capital starts fleeing the U.S., it's a financial panic, and it spreads like wildfire globally. And then there's the dollar. If it's deliberately weakened, and there's even a chance, a small chance that the U.S. might not make good on its Treasury obligations, even with those century bond swaps, well, that could destroy the dollar status as the world's reserve currency. And then things get really messy. You could see the global trading system break apart, countries scrambling for other currencies to use, forming their own little currency blocks. It would be a huge upheaval of the global financial order.
It's a sobering thought. And we're already seeing reactions to all of this, right? What are some of the key players saying and doing in response to these policies and this potential Mar-a-Lago plan?
Yeah, people are definitely taking notice. The European Union, for one, they're pretty vocal about their concerns, especially with those new tariffs on cars. They see the Mar-a-Lago plan as a big threat, and they're not holding back. EU leaders are saying it could lead to some serious economic trouble, and they're talking about taking steps to protect their own businesses. They've also made it clear that they'll retaliate against those steel and aluminum tariffs the U.S. already put in place. And then there's the whole relationship between President Trump and the EU. There's a lot of tension there. The EU isn't sure they can count on the U.S. anymore when it comes to NATO. Some even see the U.S. as an economic rival, not a reliable partner. And then you have China. Every time the U.S. raises tariffs, China hits back with counter tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, and they're getting stricter about exporting critical minerals that American industries need. They're sending a message saying, we're not going to back down from a trade war. And they're getting serious about boosting their domestic economy, becoming more self-sufficient in technology, and they're pushing their own currency, the renminbi, as an alternative to the dollar. It's all about reducing their dependence on the U.S. Even Denmark, they're not happy about President Trump's interest in buying Greenland. They see it as a sovereignty issue. They've said flat out that Greenland is not for sale. And they're worried about the U.S. using tariffs to pressure them. And the big financial institutions around the world, they're not buying it either. They don't think forcing countries to weaken the dollar and restructure their U.S. debt holdings is going to work. And they're warning that it could blow up the whole global financial system, wreck confidence in the dollar, and cause massive inflation and market chaos. Some are even calling it highly dangerous and saying it could trigger a global financial meltdown.
It sounds like the alarm bells are ringing pretty loudly. What about the big picture? What could this plan mean for things like NATO and the global bond markets?
Well, when it comes to NATO, this whole transactional approach where security is basically for sale, you pay up, you get protection, it really undermines the whole point of the alliance. It's about trust, shared responsibility. But President Trump keeps questioning Article 5, that core principle of defending each other. And he wants everyone to spend way more on defense. It's making allies wonder if they can really rely on the U.S. anymore, and that could weaken NATO's ability to deter threats. It could even lead to the alliance breaking apart, with countries going their own way on defense, maybe getting closer to other powers for security. That would be a major shift, and it could make the world a lot less stable. And then the bond markets, those are in for a rough ride if this plan keeps going, forcing countries to trade their short-term U.S. Treasury bonds for those long-term low-interest century bonds. And talking about user fees on those holdings, it's basically saying, we might not pay you back on our own terms. That could really hurt the reputation of U.S. debt, make investors think twice before buying treasuries. We could see a massive sell-off of U.S. bonds, driving those yields way up, making borrowing way more expensive, and that could easily spill over into a full-blown global financial crisis. And then there's the dollar, the one that's supposed to be weakened. That could backfire too. If countries get nervous about the dollar's stability with the U.S. messing with its value and playing hardball on economic policy, they'll start looking for other currencies to use for trade and as reserves. We could see those currency blocks emerge, challenging the dollar's dominance. It's a whole lot of risk, a lot of potential for things to go sideways.
So, stepping back, looking at all this, is the Mar-a-Lago Plan just like a bunch of policies thrown together to grab whatever advantage the U.S. can get, or is it something bigger, a fundamental shift in how the U.S. sees its role in the global economy?
It's definitely more than just opportunism. I think it really represents a shift towards economic nationalism, this idea that the U.S. needs to put itself first, even if it means bending the rules or shaking things up.
Yeah.
And they're doing it in a very unilateral way, not really interested in cooperating with others unless it's on their terms. The focus on weakening the dollar, those aggressive tariffs, and how they see alliances like NATO, it's all about maximizing U.S. power and benefits, even if it ruffles some feathers. And I think it's influenced by this idea of new neoliberalism, which basically says the world is a competitive jungle, you got to be strong to survive, and we're going to look out for ourselves first. It's a big change from how the U.S. has operated on the global stage for a long time, and it could have some pretty big consequences.
So what are we watching for? What are the biggest risks, the things that could tip this whole thing over the edge?
Oh, there are plenty of risks. The biggest one is those tariffs. They could easily spiral into big trade wars, disrupting those intricate supply chains that keep the global economy humming, hurting trade, and slowing down growth for everyone. And then there's the potential for a financial crisis with those unorthodox debt plans and that deliberate weakening of the dollar. Investors could panic, ditch U.S. assets, and the whole thing could snowball. And of course, there's the geopolitical risk.
Yeah.
As the U.S. gets more assertive, more willing to throw its weight around, tensions are going to rise, both with allies and rivals. There are a few things that could be real turning points. A debt crisis triggered by investors losing faith in U.S. Treasury bonds, that's a big one. Or a complete breakdown of international cooperation, where everyone starts putting up trade barriers and those global agreements fall apart. And then there's NATO. If that alliance really starts to fracture, that's a huge blow to global security and could lead to some very unpredictable and dangerous realignments. It's a lot to keep an eye on, that's for sure.
It really is. So this Mar-a-Lago Plan, what does it tell us about how countries might be using economics to get what they want in the 21st century? Is it a sign of things to come?
I think it's a pretty strong signal that economic power is becoming the weapon of choice. Countries are realizing that they can use things like tariffs, currency manipulation, investment restrictions to influence each other to get their way. It's like a new kind of economic warfare. And the Mar-a-Lago Plan, it's pushing the boundaries of that, challenging the whole idea of a rules-based international system where everyone plays fair. It's more about might makes right, and we've got the economic might, and that's a dangerous path. It
Right.
can lead to a world where it's every country for itself, where cooperation breaks down and everyone loses in the end.
It's a lot to think about. The Mar-a-Lago Plan, those reactions from allies and the markets, it all paints a pretty complex picture, doesn't it? This idea that the U.S. might be trying to reshape the whole global economic order to its advantage, it's a huge deal. And comparing it to the Plaza Accord, seeing those echoes of the past but in such a different world, it really highlights the potential for things to go wrong, for unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And it underlines just how interconnected everything is in the global economy. What the U.S. does, it has ripple effects everywhere, and we're all feeling them, whether we realize it or not.
Well, that's a great place to leave it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, and we'll keep following this story as it unfolds. It's one that could have implications for all of us for years to come.
Yeah, definitely one to keep watching.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.